So listen to this. Here and there I like to put up polls on this channel's community page, and normally I agree with your picks, but a few days ago I put up one almost as a trick question, and the results shocked me. 91% of you consider Rui Costa to be a better player than Futre, and the conclusion I took from that was very simple. Most of you have no idea who Paulo Futre is. Even Rui Costa would pick Futre ahead of himself. It was literally his idol, and personally, I get it. If you ask me who are the best Portuguese players of all time, my answer would be Eusebio, Figo, Ronaldo, and right after that, Paulo Futre. In fact, I would say he was the biggest talent out of those four. There's a reason they call him the Portuguese Maradona. Anyone who watched him, any player who came across him, was left completely speechless, often just completely in love. Figo himself once said, "The first time I saw Futre, it felt like I had just seen God himself." Even the literal mayor of Madrid said, "If something happens and I end up dead, spread my ashes on the left wing of the Vicente Calderón so Futre can step on them every time he dashes towards goal." His list of admirers is endless. Aragonés, who led Spain to the Euros in 2008, said he was the best player he ever coached. Baresi said he was so good that it made him emotional to watch him play. Cruyff said he was one of his favorite players of all time. Fernando Torres called him his idol. And above all, Maradona himself referred to him as one of his greatest rivals. Even Maradona's own son once told the press that Futre was one of the players his father talked about the most, all despite the fact they only faced off once. And honestly, it made sense. Futre was like a Maradona clone. Not only was he just as crazy and controversial as Maradona, but he ran, shot, and dribbled like him. Even as kids, they were similar. Just picture this. When Futre was 9, the team from his hometown was invited to take part in a tournament hosted by Sporting CP, but it was an under-13 tournament and you had to be at least 10 to enter, so they just faked his ID, got him on the bus, and convinced everyone he was some other kid. However, Futre then pretty much took over the whole tournament, even leading his small team to beat Sporting and take their trophy in their own turf, which quickly got Aurelio Pereira, the same scout who would eventually discover Figo and Cristiano Ronaldo, to come after the boy trying to sign him, not even realizing that he was using a fake name. Regardless, eventually they figured it out and he did sign for them. He was shy at first, but after scoring 7 goals in his first game, he quickly became the coolest kid in the club. Only a few years later, at 14, he was already so convinced he'd become the next all-time great that he simply quit school, though his father would force him to work in a mechanic shop as a sort of punishment. But still, he would keep on scoring 4 to 5 goals a game, winning every competition he set foot in, and at 17, they just couldn't wait any longer. Sporting gave him his debut, and as the commentators said that day, they just threw the kid into the fire and hoped to God he wouldn't burn. But man, in reality, he was the one setting everyone ablaze, and just a few weeks later, the call-up came. At 17 years of age, Futre was the youngest to ever play for the Portuguese national team, and to this day, the record stands. Not Figo, not Ronaldo, not Felix, Futre is still the biggest prodigy of them all. But still, at Sporting, things got complicated. You see, on one hand, they refused to give him anything more than 20 minutes per game, claiming he was too young. But on the other hand, 20 minutes at a time, Futre had managed to send waves across Europe, and by the time he turned 18, he was being called up to play for the World 11. He was a superstar, but Sporting, somehow, were the only ones who didn't see that, and as the next season started, they made what may be the biggest mistake in the history of Portuguese football. They tried to loan him away while they promoted other academy kids to the first team and offered them twice as much money as they did Futre. He felt like a dog being kicked out of the club. As he said, it was the saddest day of his life. But thankfully for him, there was someone watching. I wouldn't call him a guardian angel, but he did save him that time around. I'm talking about Pinto da Costa, FC Porto president and pretty much the Don Corleone of Portuguese football. The moment he realized what was happening, he sent a guy down to Lisbon and told him to wait by Futre's car outside of Sporting's training center, saying sooner or later he'll have to show up. And the moment he did, the guy literally just went, "Hey Futre, do you want to play for Porto?" And the kid, still feeling kind of lost, just got into the car. They dropped him off at Porto's offices in Lisbon, and the moment he got there, Pinto da Costa was already on the phone waiting for him. He picked it up and heard him say, "So Paulo, they don't want you there, huh? Well, here it's you plus 10 men, and I don't care who those 10 guys are, but you'll play every single time." And Futre, despite having been a Sporting fan since his childhood, just caved in, being to the Costa sent the kid to an hotel in the middle of nowhere where Sporting couldn't get to him, then used a loophole in the Portuguese law to terminate his contract with his old club, citing the reason as psychological damage, then offered him a contract only rivaled by that of Fernando Gomes, a literal two-time European Golden Boot winner, and before you knew it, Futre was playing for Porto. Still, things weren't pretty. The Sporting fans took no half measures when it came to getting revenge. They saw him as a traitor, and so they repeatedly vandalized his parents' house, completely taking it out on his family to the point one day Futre called his mom and she angrily asked him, "What have you done to this family?" He quickly hit back, "Mom, it's okay, I'll buy you a new house." And she said, "Paulo, don't you get it? We don't want your money. We want our old life back." And those words broke him. He felt like he belonged nowhere. He almost quit football and went back to working in a mechanic shop, hoping things would go back to normal. What saved his career was that the moment he arrived in the city of Porto, he was instantly treated like a king. And not only did that touch his heart, it motivated him to push harder, to pay back the city for the love he had received. And man, did he pay them back. Right in his first year, he paired up so incredibly with Fernando Gomes that it propelled the striker to his second European Golden Boot and the club to their first league title in 6 years. In his second season, not only did he help them take the league title once again, but he was named as the best player in the league at the age of only 19. And in his third year, with Porto getting a shot at the European Cup, it took things to a whole new level. First, with a favorable draw against Rabat Ajax, he popped off, being directly involved in 4 out of Porto's 9 goals. Then, in the next round, they drew Vitkovica, and after a first leg 1-0 defeat, they pulled back 3-0, with Futre scoring an absolute beauty of a solo goal to end the match. Then, already in the quarterfinals, things got a lot more heated, with Porto facing off against Schmeichel's and Brian Laudrup's Brøndby, taking the narrow win at home and then holding on for dear life over the second leg, and eventually pulling off the 1-goal draw and earning a place in the semi-finals against none other than the Ballon d'Or holder Igor Belanov and one of the strongest Dynamo Kiev sides of all time that had just won the Cup Winners' Cup. And of course, then to make the stakes even higher, the Prime Minister himself told Futre that if he won the match, his mandatory military service would be suspended. So it was literally a matter of making it to the European Cup final or ending up in the army. So it might not be too surprising to hear that Futre was the one to open the score sheet with an incredible goal, eventually culminating in a 2-1 win, with everyone in Kiev still believing that they would be able to turn the game around at home. But instead, even though Futre was playing through injury and had only managed to make it onto the pitch after 7 shots of cortisone, just 3 minutes into the match he won the free kick that would put Porto in front, and 7 minutes later Gomes scored another, and just like that Porto were in the European Cup final. But there was only a little problem. Aside from a Cup Winners' Cup they lost, Porto had never been in a major international final, and awaiting for them in Vienna were Bayern Munich with Matthaus, Brema and Rummenigge. And you know what they say, football is a simple game. You play 11 versus 11, and in the end, the Germans win. Porto's odds weren't the best. In fact, they were so bad that the day before the match, the president of UEFA legitimately asked Pinto da Costa by how many goals you think you lose, and I guess he had a point. By halftime, they were already losing. There didn't seem to be much hope at all. In fact, Futre was one of the few whose belief seemed unshaken, but then it was him. He took the ball, found his way in between 3 players, played a 1-2, made past another 2, then a third and a fourth, and with the goalkeeper left, he passed it to Majer, but he failed to get a touch. This could have easily been one of the greatest Champions League final goals of all time, and it could have changed the course of the match. Except, you know what? It did. With that run, Futre showed the team it was possible, and if Majer had wasted a chance for a great goal then, 12 minutes later he made it up to the team, scoring his famous back heel and then supplying Juari with the assist for the winning goal just 2 minutes later. Against all odds, Porto were champions of Europe for the first time in their history, and even if Juari and Majer were involved in both goals, when the man of the match award was handed out, there was no question. That could only be one man, Paulo Futre. The next day, the newspapers in Portugal read, "Futre, the next Maradona." And Barcelona, well, they still needed a Maradona replacement, and the board was very interested. The only reason they didn't sign him was because the coach, Terry Venables, had a major English bias, also rejecting Van Basten and Hugo Sanchez in favor of, roll the drums, Steve Archibald. Yeah, he was sacked soon after. Regardless, that was no problem. Real wanted him, Juve wanted him, and above all, Inter wanted him, and they wanted him bad. But 2 days before he was supposed to sign contract with them, another man showed up out of nowhere in Milan. His name was Gil y Gil. He was running for president of Atletico and was willing to do anything to have Futre campaign alongside him. He was so desperate that when Porto surprised him with the fact he had renewed Futre's contract overnight and that he now had a much higher release clause, he didn't even blink. He just accepted that he had to pay whatever they asked for, which this time around meant 3.2 million euros, meaning Futre was the second most expensive signing in the history of La Liga. Just guess who was the number one? Yeah, Maradona. Kind of a recurring theme, huh? And actually, funny enough, the two met for the first time that year when they played together in a charity match. And also, guess who was Futre's first coach at Atletico? It was Menotti, the same guy who had coached Maradona at Barcelona. And you know what he said when they asked him about Futre's similarities to the great man? He said, "It's clear in my eyes that he'll be successor." But stepping aside from all the Maradona talk, Futre was the first Portuguese player to get a big money move to a top club, and the fact it was a move to Spain didn't help. The rivalry is eternal. Many of the Spanish players didn't like the fact that the best player in the league was Portuguese, and that was reflected on how he was treated on the pitch. As he said, there were tackles where the stadium went silent. They said, "He's dead." But I got up and ran towards the defender every single time and I told him, "Soy Português. If you're gonna bring a pistol to the pitch, you better bring extra bullets, cause I'll get up every single time." And he really wasn't lying. It seemed no one could stop him. They had brought him in order to put an end to Real and Barcelona's reign over Spanish football, and just 10 matches in, he had already beaten Barcelona, led Atletico to a 4-0 demolition over Real, and by the time the New Year's came around, it almost happened. Futre placed second in the Ballon d'Or behind only Ruud Gullit, and honestly, it isn't too hard to find someone who'll tell you this was pure robbery. Rui Costa said it only happened because back then every Ballon d'Or was given to someone playing in Italy. Pinto da Costa said it happened only because Real had influence over UEFA and didn't want an Atletico player winning the Ballon d'Or. The newspaper Diario AS called it the most unfair Ballon d'Or voting of all time. Figo and Mourinho shared the same feeling. Even Christian Vieri said, "The people know, Atletico knows, and Portugal too. The awards don't matter. It doesn't matter if you agree or you don't. When you're a genius, you're a genius." And you know what's funny? Even 35 years later, when they tried to get Gullit to comment on the subject, he refused. Regardless, even if on that first year with Atletico, Futre didn't manage to stop Real and Barcelona from taking all the trophies, he did become the foundation of what would come later on. He did become the image of the club, an icon, an idol, a leader. And so when his second season started, despite being just 22, despite being Portuguese, Gil y Gil, who had grown to treasure Futre as if he was his own son, surprised him by handing him the captain's armband. But as much as it made sense, as much as Futre was as Atletico as it gets, fiery, crazy, and a tough nut to crack, over the following 2 years, no matter how many times he set stadiums ablaze, even being applauded at the Camp Nou at one point, Atletico never quite managed to take any silverware, and every year, Futre seemed to get physically weaker and weaker, with injuries slowly taking a hold of his game and becoming more and more common. But still, on his 4th year at the club, despite being sidelined for over a month on 3 different occasions, it finally happened. Having already beaten Real in the Copa del Rey last 16, Futre opened the scoring against Barcelona in the semi-finals with a magnificent lob, eventually making it to the final and beating Mallorca to the title. It was a massive achievement, but now, looking back, it's hard not to feel like this title was a mere backdrop for what would happen the following season. With Futre getting back in form and playing the last injury-free season of his career, Atletico made it to the final of the Copa del Rey once more, and between them and their chance to revalidate their title stood only Real Madrid, and the final would be played at the Bernabeu. A win would feel sweeter than 1,000 trophies. It would be poetic, and so poetic it was, with Schuster, an ex-Real Madrid player, scoring the opener and Futre sealing the deal with a strike from an impossible angle. Aside from the European Cup win, it was maybe the greatest moment of his career, as he would eventually say, "That day I got the King of Spain to speak Portuguese." However, as young as he was then, it was at that moment that everything started going wrong. There are many theories regarding what led to it, Some say it was because of the club's financial troubles, others say Futre was worn out from his injuries and wanted something new, but midway through the following season, Futre left Atletico and his career descended into complete chaos. With Inter once again looking to sign him, he ended up going against everything that was expected of him and instead joining Benfica, becoming one of the few people to have played for all three Portuguese greats. Once there, he went completely unbeaten for the rest of the season and still didn't manage to take the title away from Porto. However, not only did he lead Benfica to the Portuguese Cup final, but he pulled off one of the greatest performances of his career, scoring twice and assisting another to take the trophy. At that moment, he couldn't be blamed for thinking he was about to experience some sort of revival, but in fact, he could only play because his knee was pumped full of cortisone, and then, well, Benfica got into a massive financial crisis, leading most of their top players to terminate their contracts, while Futre secured the transfer to Marseille, who had just won the Champions League. Again, that seems great at first, but the moment he arrived, the massive corruption scandal began boiling up. Marseille ended up being banned from the European competitions, and it all got so bad that every player on the squad was given permission to leave, and the winter market even ended up opening up 2 months earlier than usual, in November, just so everyone could get out of there. And so, despite having barely played for Marseille, Futre followed the current and almost joined Real, but ended up rejecting their offer at the last minute because he was afraid of what his kids would have to deal with in Madrid once his father was labeled as a traitor once again. And so, instead, he reached an agreement with AC Milan that would see him first sign for newly promoted Reggiana for 6 months in order to help them stay afloat before joining the Rossoneri, who would have been his 5th different club in 2 years. Regardless, he wouldn't even get to that point, as on his very first match for Reggiana, after scoring an incredible goal, he was hit with a heavy tackle and fell into the ground seemingly in tremendous pain. He had ruptured his patellar tendon, and according to the experts at the time, he was only the second ever athlete to have this injury. He was immediately put into a full leg cast and no one really knew what to do. No doctor wanted to touch him. And as I once heard someone say, at his first surgery there were 100 journalists around him, at the second there were about 50, by the third there were 2 or 3 at most. Though initially expected to take about 3 months to recover from, his injury left him on the sidelines for almost a year. He was only 27 years old at the time. And once he was back, things were never the same. He did end up joining AC Milan, but even though Capello and Baresi sang praises about him, he was only afforded 1 appearance just so he could take the league title. And so, he ended up moving to West Ham, where after only 9 matches, he would end up temporarily retiring at 30 years of age. Only to then come back to Atletico after a manager jokingly asked him to train with the team, only to realize that even with half a knee, some extra pounds and a ton of cigarette smoke in his lungs, he would still outshine the rest of the players. At the preseason ceremony, Gil repeatedly tried to start his speech, but he simply couldn't. The screams of the fans overpowered even the speakers. They only wanted to hear one man, Futre. But still, 2 years later, he quit for good, having played only 68 matches since turning 27, most of them as a substitute. As Rui Costa would say, every football fan deserved to have watched Futre for a lot longer.